The render operator is used to define what particle flow will pass the render engine at render time. It can also be used to pass the particles to the render engine in different mesh formats, which can be helpful when optimizing your render time, memory performance, or render speed. And this particular option is something that will probably work different with different rendering systems. If you use it with the scanline system, Mental Ray, Brazil, V-Ray, you're probably going to get different results with how you hand over the meshes to that rendering system. Generally, the operator is used in the global event, which you can see up here, as it can then be used to control all of your particles in your system. However, it is actually possible to use a render operator in each individual event, giving you control over your render time performance per event. So let's have a look at the parameters for this operator. You can see in our flow, in the global event, I have a render operator set up, but you can see it's turned off. In the first event, I've got a render operator, and in the last event, I've got a render operator. In the first event, I've got it using bounding boxes. So you can see I've got an option between none, which will actually pass nothing onto the renderer, bounding boxes, geometry, and phantom. The default option is geometry. In other words, whatever the geometry is of your particles, pass that on to the renderer. So if I turn on geometry and do a quick render, you'll see that actually these are actually quite small, so I'll just bump up the size of these particles a bit just to so we can see them a little bit more clearly. There we go. So you can see at render time we're getting these very simple spheres rendering. If I change this value here to bounding boxes, you can see in the viewport they stay exactly the same. But at render time, it's doing a bounding box around each object, each mesh, instead of handing on the actual geometry which is set up by the shape operator. So that can be useful when you're doing simple tests and you just want to substitute the normal geometry with a bounding box. If I set it to nothing, you'll get nothing. And if I set it to phantom, it'll pass on all the information, various information to the renderer, but basically by default the renderer will render nothing. So if I render that, you get nothing as well. Phantom though is actually passing on information to the renderer, and if you've got a third-party plugin, something that can actually pick up that phantom data and use it, say the scale of the particles, the speed of the particles and so on, that plugin can then leap in at render time and actually produce something to render, whatever that may be. Let's say it's a procedural surface or so forth. So I'll put it back to the first option, bounding boxes. So you can see that what we have in our flow is our particles get emitted, they fly through the air, and then if I actually give them a little bit more speed, just maybe a little bit more dynamic. There we go. And I'll change the this gravity force a little bit. I'll increase its strength so they have a bit more of an arc. So they fly out of the ground. After a certain amount of time, they change into these yellow particles. That's when they're passed on to the next event. And you can see that when they get passed on to the next event, they use a different material. This material called static yellow. So you can see they change color. And at render time, you would obviously expect to see that. But what I've actually done is I've set up this render operator to display none. So when I do a render, you'll actually find that there aren't any yellow particles being rendered. There you go. So if I go back to this one and change it to geometry, if I want these to be rendered, I can actually go in here and change it back to geometry as well. And now at render time, we'll get the full geometry which is rendering. There we go. So you can see you've got an option here of actually controlling what is rendered at render time explicitly. Now, if I turn on the operator in the global event, and I'll just set that to none and do a render, you can see that it's been superseded by these operators that actually come after it. So to get this operator to take effect, just turn off these operators. I'll do a render now, and you can see it's set to geometry at the moment. If I set it to none, you can see it's having its effect on all the particles in the system. If I set it to bounding boxes, and we'll get bounding boxes for all the particles. Now, an interesting thing to note is something that we covered in DVD 1 in the series, particle flow fundamentals, and that is